1735 then is that turning point, conversion of Daniel Rowland and Howell Harris. It's also the point at which George Whitefield is converted. And George Whitefield, born in 1714, the same year as Howell Harris. He would die in 1770. He's born near the Welsh border. He's not Welsh, he's very English. His great gift growing up, he grew up in a home where his father had died when he was 2. His mother raised him. She owned an inn, a pub. He had finished school. She longed for him much better things, to go to university. He couldn't go to university. He didn't have the money. She would save the money eventually to send him. But in his teen years, he worked in a pub, the pub his mother owned. And he wasn't great at school. When people remembered him later, they remembered he had a great gift for acting. And he knows how to utilize the stage. There's no doubt about that. Finally, his mother is able to put together enough money, and so he goes up to Oxford in 1731 when he is 17 years old. He gets to Oxford and he meets the Wesley brothers. And they've started a little club. It doesn't have a name. People in the university call it the Holy Club. It's a term of mockery and derision. This is a group of young men in a very godless age who are seeking to do what Martin Luther did, to live lives of goodness and Christian morals that would recommend them to God. In other words, they're really trying to work their way to heaven. But they're remarkable young men. They would meet every morning or a good number of mornings of the week for prayer and Bible study. John Wesley was already ordained an Anglican priest, and sometimes they'd have the Lord's Supper on a weekly basis. They'd go and visit the prisons. There was a prison in Oxford, it no longer exists, called the Picardo prison. That's where Thomas Cranmer had been imprisoned. That's where Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer had been burned in the Reformation, and Cranmer himself. They'd go and visit the poor, but they're not converted. The last to join the group is George Whitefield. He's the first to be saved within 4 years. He's converted when? Easter 1735. The exact same time period as Rowland and Harris. His main spiritual guide in his early years, he gets ordained as an Anglican deacon by 1736, and within a couple of years an Anglican priest or a minister. His main spiritual guide is a Puritan, Matthew Henry. Matthew Henry died the year that Whitefield was born, 1714, and he published after his death, it was published his commentary on the entire Bible. Whitefield would read the commentary on his knees, would often take his sermons from Matthew Henry's comments. In fact, the first sermon that Whitefield ever preached was from Ecclesiastes, and you can actually go down through the sermon and you can see Whitefield's main points right there in Matthew Henry's commentary. In his early years of preaching, he began to preach on the new birth. There were the churches he preached in, and he preached in a number, had not heard a sermon like this for probably the best part of 75 years. What they'd heard were moralistic sermons, if they had heard that. The new birth was something different. He knew he had needed the new birth. He had striven as a moralist. He nearly killed himself, actually, fasting. He knew that men and women needed the new birth. They must first be able to live before they must first be made alive by God before they could live for God. We don't do good works to enter into life. We are first made alive, and then we do good works. See, he had the same message as the Puritans and the Reformers. Doors that were opened soon began to be shut to him. Ministers didn't want to hear this. And it was Griffith Jones, the same man who was instrumental in the conversion of Daniel Rowland, who meets Whitefield and says, why don't you go and preach out in the open air? You can do it. You're an Anglican minister. It was illegal for Baptists, Presbyterians, or Congregationalists to preach out in the open air. They could only preach in registered buildings with the state, church buildings. But an Anglican minister could preach out in the open air. And so Whitefield, in 1739, takes to the open air in February of 1739. And the place he chooses is Bristol. It's one of the suburbs of Bristol, a community of miners, men who spent their time in the bowels of the earth, who are physically filthy and morally filthy, who spent their time off drunk or engaged in horrific pastimes like cockfighting, where they would people would have roosters, and they'd bet on them and see which one could kill the others. Or sexual immorality. And Whitefield took his stand. You can actually go to a little place, it's called Hannah Mount. I've been there once. And somebody, in my mind, has spoiled it because they stuck up a wooden pulpit. But they have a sign there that said that on this very spot, it's in the middle of a housing survey now. You've got all these houses around, built in the 1960s, and there you've got this spot they kept where Whitefield stood and preached to a community, this community of miners, about 200 of them. And on that day in February of 1739, God saved a number of them. And Whitefield went back the next day and began to go back a number of days, and news got to Bristol. People began to come out, and soon Whitefield, within a year or two, is preaching to congregations out in the open air in Bristol and then up in London of a few thousand people. And he will go to America, 1739. He will make 7 trips to America. Some of them, he'll be here for 3 years. By the time he dies in 1770 in Newburyport, just outside of Boston, he has preached probably in every major town in America, all and up and down the Atlantic seaboard. Every American knows 2 men called George. One they love, George Whitefield. And one they're increasingly hating, the tyrant George III. And Whitefield has a remarkable ministry here. He goes to Boston, for instance, 8,000 people in Boston in 1740. He gets to Boston, first Sunday, 2,000 come out to hear him. They probably came, if you ever go to Boston, it's Old South Church. He would go back there a number of times. It would be there in Old South Church, a young African American who had been enslaved at 7 years old in Ghana and brought over in the 1740s. It would be there in the 1760s she would hear Whitefield and be converted. Phyllis Wheatley. And she would write some of the most exquisite poetry. Probably the first African-American poetess. Whitefield went to Boston first Sunday in 1740. 2,000 came to hear him. Second Sunday, 8,000 people. They can't fit the church, obviously. They go out to Boston Common. The third Sunday, Benjamin Franklin is there. Benjamin Franklin and Whitefield will strike up a friendship. Franklin loves Whitefield. Franklin is a deist. He will lay out his beliefs in 1790. In 1790, a man named Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale University, a cousin of Jonathan Edwards, will write to him and say, "What do you believe about Jesus Christ?" And Franklin says, "That's a fascinating question. What I believe is this, is that Jesus is the best moral teacher the world has ever seen. I believe in the immortality of the soul, that there is one God, and God will reward us for the good we've done in this life. As for the question whether Jesus is God or not, well," he said, "that's a pretty, it's a pretty abstract question. I'm about to find out, and I'm quite certain God won't bar me from heaven because I couldn't believe that Jesus was God." Within a few months of that, he would be dead. But he had listened to Whitefield again and again. There's a great letter from Whitefield, one occasion, which he writes to Benjamin Franklin. And he said, I'm hearing again and again your name mentioned. You've become one of the great wonders of the age, and you've discovered the properties of electricity. Let me recommend to you the mysteries of the gospel." They had numerous conversations. The first Sunday Franklin ever saw Whitefield was on that third Sunday in 1740 when he saw Whitefield preaching in Boston. Franklin said, I had heard he had preached to 10,000 in Britain. I didn't believe it. So what he did was he paced out the circumference of the crowd and figured out by mathematical formulae. I've got no idea what those formulae are. Don't ask me. Math has never been my strong suit. So he paces out the crowd and figures out that day there were 15,000 people. They must have stood at least maybe upwards of a mile back. Could they hear Whitefield? There's a recent acoustic scientist has done studies on the places where Whitefield often preached and has figured out that given a certain level of power in his vocal cords and etc., he could be heard up to a mile. Absolutely incredible. Sometimes after preaching like that, he'd spit up blood. And he was destroying his lungs. He would actually die of an asthmatic attack in 1770. Between his conversion in 1735 and 1770, he preached 18,000 sermons. 35 years. You can do the math. 35 into 18,000. That's a lot. Some days he might preach 3 times a day. The only days he didn't preach were the days he was crossing the Atlantic, when he was shut up in a boat. If the captain of the boat didn't allow him to preach, he'd be shut up for 6 weeks, 2 months, or longer. He would use those times for spiritual meditation, reading the scriptures, prayer, preparation of sermons. And when he got to America, he was kind of like the guy hit the ground running. And during his time in New England, his second time in America, between 1740 and 1742, there were close to 50,000 conversions out of a population of 250,000 people. That's just New England. That's not the middle colonies, New York and Pennsylvania. It's not the southern colonies. Up until the Great Awakening, what we call the Great Awakening, the Baptist churches, there were about 25 Baptist churches in all of America by 1740. By the end of the century, they are the second largest growing denomination next to the Methodists. It's always been amazing to me how the Methodists grew so fast in one sense, because John Wesley, their head, was a fervent opponent of the American Revolution. And you'd think everybody would associate the Methodists with the English crown. For some reason, under the American leaders like Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke, they were able to break free from that stigma, and they became Americanized. And there are these waves of revival that America undergoes also through the 18th century. And at the heart of them, up until 1770, is George Whitefield. It would be easy, and for many years, Whitefield was remembered primarily as a preacher. He has a theology. He is a rock-solid Calvinist. And anybody who ever says, and I've heard this said, Calvinism undermines missions. Like, what kind of church history are you reading? Maybe you can find a few guys like Herman Hoeksema up in Grand Rapids, the head of the Protestant, whatever the church is, the Reformed Protestant church that he's part of. Yeah, I mean, he's against the free offer of the gospel. You tell him, really? John Newton and Daniel Rowland and Howell Harris and George Whitefield and on and on and on. All of these Calvinistic ministers, Jonathan Edwards and the man who mentored by Edwards, and on and on. And Whitefield has this tremendous ministry. And what's important about Whitefield is that he was acceptable. Because he was a Calvinist, he was acceptable in America. He was acceptable in England. He's English. And in Wales. The Wesley brothers never really made it in Wales. Methodism was never strong in Wales. And Calvinist Scotland, well, Whitefield was welcome there, and the Wesleys weren't. And so it's Whitefield who unites the revival. The only place in the English-speaking world that Whitefield had a very rude reception, well, he had a rude reception in a number of places, which I'll talk about in a minute, but the one place he never went back to was Ireland. He nearly got killed in Ireland and never went back. The Wesleys, on the other hand, went back again and again. Again, as I said, Whitefield, he had a rich theology that underlay his preaching. But he was a remarkable preacher. He had this incredible voice. And he was an actor. He was a gifted actor. One of the great actors of the day, who I would compare to Kenneth Branagh. But when I've done that comparison, a lot of people say, who on earth is Kenneth Branagh? So I hate to say George Clooney or Brad Pitt or Tom Hanks. I mean, I like those guys, but George Clooney's always George Clooney, and Brad Pitt's always Brad Pitt. The one North American actor who is really a good actor is Johnny Depp, he's a character actor. He can switch characters, and George Clooney's always George Clooney. Anyway, so whoever you want to compare, one of the great actors of the day, David Garrick, used to go and listen to Whitefield, and he said to friends, if only I could say Mesopotamia, the way Whitefield could say it. And Whitefield had this remarkable gift of preaching. He was not, as I said, without using acting. One occasion, he's at Moorfields, one of the great huge parks in London, where they used to have fairs. And there was a tree that he used to like to, he'd take his portable pulpit and he'd set it up under a tree, and then about a dozen brothers would surround the pulpit. They would pray and protect him. One occasion, he's preaching on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And he gets to that part where he says, and the trump of God shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. And he's no sooner read that than suddenly, from the tree behind him, suddenly this trumpet blows out. He's got this guy up in the tree blowing this trumpet. He's just before he's done it, he's got this pregnant pause. He's paused, the whole cloud is quiet, and suddenly they hear the trumpet. Hark! Is that Gabriel's trump I hear? It's completely hokey, but... On the other hand, you get these occasions, though, when you get these unforeseen events. Like the guy who got up in the same tree, and Whitfield's preaching on heaven and hell, and he's talking about hell, but he notices the people in the front row are snickering, and then he realizes they're not looking at him. They're looking above him. So he turns around. There's some guy up there who's exposing his rear end. He's climbed up in the tree, and he's exposing himself. Whitefield, without missing a beat, this is exactly what I was talking about. Here is a man, a picture of human depravity. Why we are all going to hell unless we repent and believe. And so you have this remarkable ability to play with the events that might transpire. He only had about 100 sermons. He knew them enormously well. He didn't have to, he wasn't preaching in the same crowd every week, right? He wasn't a parish minister. As we'll see, he gets into a theological debate with the Wesleys. He has a Catholic spirit. He loves the Wesleys, but he's not afraid of disagreeing with them, and we'll see that. The one area in which he is theologically weak, he has a very rich Calvinism, soteriology, a confidence in the Word of God as the inerrant Scriptures. He is weak on ecclesiology. And just one little example, and then we'll take questions if you want to illustrate this. In 1742, he's invited to Scotland. He's invited by two men, Ralph and Ebenezer Erskine, E-R-S-K-I-N-E. The Erskines are very interesting figures. Their mother gave birth to them after she was buried. Their father, around 1680, his wife died, their mother, and he buried her. And he's later back, he was a minister, later back in the manse, and he's with a friend who's commiserating with him, and they hear a knock at the door. And their father says, if I hadn't buried my wife a few hours ago, I'd swear that was her. And he goes to the door, and it's his wife. And what had happened was that the sexton of the church, the man who's in charge of the final details of burial, had noticed on the ring finger on the opposite hand from the marriage, so it'd be the right hand, a valuable ring on Erskine's wife's hand. He determined what he'd do after the coffin was put down into the grave. Before they put the dirt on, he'd go down and get the ring. So everybody's gone. He opens the coffin, and he tries to pull the ring off. Well, it won't come off, so he gets a knife, and he's going to cut the finger off. He's no sooner cut it than she awakens. She was in some sort of deep coma. And he's going to cut, and he's terrified. He thinks she's dead. So she turns up at the door, very much alive, and has two more children, Ralph and Ebenezer Erskine, these great preachers of the gospel. And I remember, I really kind of played that out, because I remember the first time I was told the story in Northern Ireland by a Scottish Presbyterian minister. He dragged it out for about half an hour and really kind of played it up. I initially thought it was some sort of ghost story, and it was, I know this is the weirdest thing. Here's this gospel Presbyterian minister telling us a ghost story late one night, it was a Friday night, and it was just, anyway, so it was a fabulous story. And these two brothers became gospel ministers, and in the 1720s, they'd had a dispute in the Church of England. They left the Church of England, and they had their own little denomination called the Associate Reformed Presbyterians. And they invited Whitefield to come up to Scotland to preach for them. Whitefield comes up. Meanwhile, there's been a revival breakout near Glasgow in the Church of Scotland. Whitefield goes over there to preach as well. They're furious at him. We didn't invite you here, they said, to preach for them. We left them. We invited you to preach only for us. Whitefield's response was this: brothers, if the Pope invited me to preach in the Vatican, I'd go preach. And it illustrates, number one, his love of preaching the gospel, but it also illustrates ecclesiology was not his strong suit. And that will become a hallmark of evangelicalism. We have not been strong on our thinking about the church. Granted, the church is a secondary issue, but it's still very important. Whitefield majored on primary issues, but that doesn't mean you can forget secondary issues. And that's probably the big weakness that I see, I think, in Whitefield's life. But yet God used him absolutely remarkably. And he becomes a catalyst throughout the English-speaking world for revival. Well, let me stop here. That doesn't mean, by the way, that things are going to immediately change. But it does mean that long-term there's going to be significant social change. And the big issue I've not even touched upon, it'd be very easy to think the major issues of the 18th century world are immoral sex and drink. The big issue of the 18th century is the slave trade. And what ends that, at least in the British Empire, is the revivals. And the big issue we face, it'd be very easy. I think the parallel to us today is this. The big issue we face, I don't think so much is homosexuality. The big issue I think we face is that we are killing human beings by the millions. If you add up the ones that we have aborted, we're talking about millions of children. And who will raise a voice for the unborn? And surely the blood of those innocent children has stained our culture. And the moral rot in much of our culture, is it not traceable to our culture's approval of abortion? That's our big issue, I think. the moral decline that we see, etc., I think they're more tangential. I'm not denying their significance, their importance, and I'm horrified by what's going on regarding marriage. But the brutal killing of these little ones, it is just absolutely horrifying. And it's on a parallel to what was going on in the 18th century with the slave trade, the dehumanization of a huge part of our population.